Is NATO openly acknowledging that they are in a hybrid war with Russia? And when you put out all the evidence, you realize that Putin is not playing around. I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. Let's talk about Putin's campaign here in the West. Okay, so this is an interesting video, or rather an article from The Hill. And they're saying NATO hits back against Putin's sabotage campaign, but we're going to see what constitutes hitting back, and let's temper our expectations here, right? But what is interesting is this is one of the first major U.S. articles that have come out and said Vladimir Putin's campaign by his Russian FSB, a successor agency to the KGB, is conducting what they're calling a hybrid campaign of sabotage and assassinations against the West, not just inside Ukraine. And when you stack all of the activities together, you realize that there is a lot of very strange goings on, and the Russians always seem to be involved. We talked earlier on this channel about how Putin was linked to an effort by Russian FSB agents to associate the CEO of Rheinmetall, a German arms manufacturer that makes the 155 artillery shells and military vehicles for Ukraine. And the intelligence agencies acknowledged this was just one of several plans to target defense industry executives across Europe, but this was the most mature. And usually the way this tends to work is sometimes if plans are really early, authorities will actually monitor the plans in order to help them understand kind of the networks, who's involved, how they do things, right? Learn more about kind of how the FSB operates. And only when the plan reaches a certain level of maturity, but still long before anybody's in concrete danger, they will go after them. It also helps to wait sometimes because different countries have different laws that say that, for example, it may not be illegal to joke about killing the CEO of Rheinmetall. It may not be illegal to actually sort of, talk it out, right? To sort of spitball it with your friends. But it may not become a crime until you say purchase duct tape or something. And then they say, okay, now you've committed a crime. You've started to plan this actual attack. So it's possible that law enforcement may monitor these plans, not just to gather intelligence, but to gather evidence for criminal prosecution. But this isn't just the first time. Right? When you look at everything, of course, we know that President Zelensky survived multiple assassination attempts by Russia, but early in the war. But as late as March of this year, a Russian missile strike hit 500 meters away from the convoy, targeting not just him, but also the Greek prime minister. And again, the Greek prime minister, guys, is a NATO member. That is the head of state of a NATO country. And that would be an absolute disaster if Russia was to deliberately kill a NATO head of state. But it's a sign that while Russian-backed sources of disinformation hand-wring about, oh, is this going to be Western escalation? Oh, what if you allow the U.S. missiles to strike Russian military bases? Will Putin think it's an escalation? Meanwhile, Putin's out here lobbing missiles at NATO heads of state, right? Fair to say that, again, likely it's not crazy to think this was deliberate. Right? I mean, you're talking about 500 meters of a Russian cruise missile targeting the Greek prime minister. But again, this stuff, it never percolates into the Western or the English-speaking news media, probably to avoid actually escalating the conflict. And so they're trying to keep the public calm and not acknowledge the absolute madness that Putin is facilitating, is engaging in, right? Now, obviously, we have talked extensively about Russian information operations and about Russian intelligence campaigns, right? Like the Havana Syndrome, for example, that take place in the United States. In fact, of the immigrants encountered at the U.S. border, in 2023, over 33,000 Russian citizens attempted to cross in the United States without visas. So, I mean, the scale of that is just incredible. And some of them were likely fleeing and seeking asylum in the United States. They said, hey, I'm persecuted by Putin for my beliefs. Certainly, I spoke out against the war. Now I'm facing persecution. I'm requesting asylum in the United States. But even if 1% of them are Russian sleeper agents, you're still looking at hundreds of agents infiltrating the United States. Scary stuff to think about. But even scarier is what Estonian Prime Minister calls the shadow war against the West. And just listen to this extensive series that half of these I haven't even heard about, right? Last month, French police arrested a 26-year-old Russian man who was wounded while making an explosive device in his hotel room near Charles de Gaulle International Airport. And his target was a home improvement store, right? The French intelligence identified him as, quote, part of a vast sabotage campaign orchestrated by Moscow, not pulling any punches. In May, Britain had to expel the Russian defense attaché because he was, quote, behaving as an undeclared military intelligence officer, and rescinded the diplomatic status of several Russian-owned properties because they were, quote, being used for intelligence purposes. That's likely code for that they were doubling as spy safe houses, right? Prime Minister Donald Tusk said in late May, 12 Russians were arrested for engaging in, quote, acts of sabotage on commission from Russian intelligence services. He described some of them as, quote, hired people, sometimes from the criminal world, sometimes nationals of Ukraine, Belarus, and Poland. So again, you're looking at patsies hired by the FSB to conduct acts of sabotage. And remember, we're only in May, okay? Oh, and by the way, things get even more sus. In April, an explosion destroyed part of a munitions factory in the UK. In fact, it was the UK's last ammunition facility still in operation. So again, you're looking at a Putin operation that has terminated the UK's ability to produce ammunition. And yet people say, oh, escalation. What if Putin gets even angrier if we give the Ukrainians fighter jets from the 70s? Meanwhile, Putin's out here destroying entire industries with explosives. Oh, April 15th, there's also a strange fire at the Scranton Army Ammunition Plant in Pennsylvania, run by the Joint Munitions Command Facility, which produces, oh, look at this, 155 millimeter and 105 millimeter arty rounds, as well as mortar rounds. Huh, weird. And another fire at a metallurgical plant in Germany, which manufactures missiles for Ukraine. Man, wow. It's shocking that there's not, you would think that ammunition plants would have extremely rigorous fire safety protocols, and yet somehow there's no fires only up until the Ukraine war starts, and suddenly fire safety just doesn't seem to like a priority. June 10th, another fire at a weapons plant in Poland, right? Now, the Hill is like, guys, NATO's stepping up. NATO has had enough. And like every good multilateral organization, they made a strongly worded statement saying state and non-state actors, so they're not even naming Russia, classic, are using increasingly aggressive hybrid actions against allies. We will continue to prepare, deter, defend against, and counter hybrid threats and challenges. This statement is so spineless, it doesn't even name Putin or Russia. We reiterate hybrid operation against allies could reach the level of an armed attack, which could lead to the North Atlantic Council to invoke Article 5 of the Washington Treaty. Guys, when I talk about why you don't need to worry about Putin, because he makes these vague, could, might, ought to, possibly statements, this is the NATO version of that. This is the exact same language that they use, in which they just reference things that could happen, hypotheticals. They don't draw real red lines. They don't name actual conditions. They make vague statements that kind of obliquely allude to it. And this is the same way as NATO saying, we're not going to do anything about this. They say, quote, we continue to develop our collective and individual capacity to analyze and counter hostile dis and misinformation operations. NATO is closely coordinating with allies and partners, right? And again, this is the most milquetoast non-statement that you can put out. Nothing in this statement is going to deter Putin. And I hope that behind the veil of classified information, that we have more people at the CIA are actually taking the fight back to the Russians. And I'm not saying we got to burn their plants to the ground, but at least put these agents in jail for a long time. Roll them up. Let them know that the FSB and their operations don't have a place here in the United States. Now, we're going to talk a little bit about what else NATO is doing or not doing to support Ukraine. But first, if you need the energy, you don't to get through your day, if you want to really take the fight to your day, you don't need to go burning down metallurgical plants. I guess just don't do it. Just don't. If you have those thoughts, just don't. Instead, just get some strike gum. You'll feel better, right? Get some caffeine in you. 90 milligrams of it in every piece. 100 milligrams alpha GPC. This stuff is made in the USA by Liquid Cord down in Denver using just premium ingredients. Natural caffeine derived from green coffee beans. Yeah, it's a little more expensive. Yeah, I don't make as much money as I could, right? In fact, I don't even make any money on the packs, but I know when you guys try them, I see the data. You guys order one pack, they try it. A week later, they're placing an order for a tray, right? And so if you want the best deals, you're going to get them at strikegum.com. That's where we have the new user discounts, the veteran discounts, all the discounts go into Strike Gum. You can also go on Amazon. Just search amazon.com, Strike Gum, and you'll see the proof is in the pudding. Hundreds of people have left us 5-star reviews. And a huge thank you to all of you that have, because it tells everyone at Amazon, listen, this is the caffeine gum that's made in the USA, 0 sugar, 100 milligrams alpha GPC, 90 milligrams of caffeine in every individual piece. It's not dehydrated. It doesn't taste like medicine. It tastes good. And your breath is actually going to taste minty fresh. That's the key. You get the caffeine and then you get minty fresh breath, right? Because listen, I've had the other stuff. When you chew, your mouth, your breath smells like Red Bull. It smells like a caffeine pill. It's gross. But we don't have that problem, right? Again, that's why it's made in the USA. It's not made by some cut rate manufacturer overseas that wants to squeeze a couple other cents out of us. So support us. Strike Gum. Okay. Here's what I thought was the interesting story. NATO is also saying we are buckling in for the long run, boys. NATO allies must prepare for a decade of war in Ukraine, according to Jens Stoltenberg. Right? And that is the worst case scenario for the Ukraine conflict. When asked explicitly by the BBC if NATO allies should be prepared for the war to go on for more than 10 years, Stoltenberg replied, yes. The longer we are willing to commit, the sooner this war can end. And it's called the paradox. Because Putin believes that he can wait out the West. He believes that because there's always new elections, because there's always a new perspective, that the public in these countries is going to become exasperated with war. And because that's why the Russian FSB is pushing mis and disinformation so hard. It's why you hear Russian talking points coming out of US influencers, politicians, because they scroll through Twitter and social media and they see Russian talking points and they think they found some edgy alternative view when actually what they found is likely just an AI-generated message backed by an FSB agent, knowingly or unknowingly retweeted by some influencer. And this is why they say things like, oh, escalation. And where's the tweets? Why isn't it escalation when Putin burns down a U.S. military facility? Right? Like, why isn't that escalatory? Why isn't someone saying, Putin, you shouldn't be targeting U.S. military facilities in the United States, because that would get you arrested for an Article 5 violation. That could activate, and maybe that's why. Maybe that's why so many of these things are happening, right? So we see, but this is what you get when you have this hand-wringing over escalation. So that's Putin's goal. His goal is to hope that the public in these countries gets exasperated, they lose the motivation, they lose the focus to get things done. And of course, the longer NATO commits to supporting Ukraine, the more hopeless Putin's strategy of waiting out democracies is going to be, right? This is one of the reasons that NATO policy, right? While Germany, for example, is reducing its line item budget contribution to Ukraine, dropping about $4 billion less to Ukraine in 2025, in part to fill its budget, but mostly because Germany has set up Ukraine that it doesn't need to get money from the German government, the German taxpayers every year. It's getting money from the Russians. $50 billion in loans from the interest earned on frozen Russian assets. So as long as Russia's persecuting this war against Ukraine, Ukraine is going to be cashing in on Russian assets held in Europe. So Ukraine's funding, it says, is secure for the foreseeable future thanks to European instruments and G7 loans. Washington had hoped to actually front-load the loans to give Ukraine a big lump sum now, but EU leaders said, "No, let's lock this funding in for the long term." And that's probably good because, again, as you know, Trump picked a notable anti-Ukraine aid vice presidential candidate, which can be good and bad, mostly because he's the vice president. And as you know, the vice president doesn't really have a lot of official duties, but he can exert a lot of influence depending on the president. So, again, that I hope you guys got some value out of this. That's really all I had. Of course, a huge thank you to the Colonel Tier members at CombatVetNews.com, including James Gerling, Steve Moran, Doug Beck, Alan Knudsen, Bastian Himmerling, and Yanko Georgiev. Please be sure to subscribe to the channel and hit like on the video. They're free, and it really helps tell the YouTube algorithm that I'm making legitimate quality content. I'll see you guys in the next one. Cheers.